Welcome to the Trinity Podcast. We are back for season number 3, everybody. Is that amazing? 3 seasons of the podcast. I'm here with Daniel Riddick, Tom Messer, and Tommy Carr. And you'll notice the podcast format is going to change a little bit in season 3. We're actually shortening it down a little bit and more bite-sized listening for everyone that either watches or listens. We're shooting for 30 minutes. So everyone be brief. We'll be good to go. But because of that, we're going to jump right in. You're not going to hear a lot about Jags football which
is a good thing right now.
That's true. Or the new word that Tommy wants to tell us about and the definition.
Slam number 1.
We will jump right in. So let's do it right now. Gentlemen, we're going to start the season 3 with an important conversation around this word, deconstruction. We're going to look at this topic because it really is a buzzword in Christian circles in the church world. And there's some information out there whenever people hear deconstruction, it kind of goes to this more of a negative context and a definition. But what I would like to do is to hit 2 definitions on this word and just begin a conversation about what this word means and how it relates to people that would say they are deconstructing their faith. Here are the 2 definitions. Definition 1 says deconstruction is a dismantling of one's faith and orthodox beliefs that usually has a trajectory towards full deconversion from Christianity. And that's the more common definition that people think about when they hear this word. Here's definition number 2, though. Deconstruction is a reforming of one's beliefs, moving away from possibly the trappings of some Christians, subculture, or even away from particular denomination, but with the goal of more biblical faithfulness and a deeper relationship with Jesus. So opposite ends of the spectrum there on what deconstruction could be defined as. Here's the first question. How have you, in your roles and working with people in your own faith walk, how have you seen both of these definitions play out? Who wants to answer the first question on season 3 of the podcast?
So let me say, first of all, I think there's even probably, kind of subcategories of those two, those 2 definitions. So on one hand, let's kind of frame it this way, that somebody that completely deconstructs from the faith entirely, they have doubts, which you have to state up front. Doubts are legitimate. Their doubts are a part of what it means to be human. Doubts are actually part of even the Christian faith. I mean, it's a normal thing for people to doubt. What typically happens is, for whatever reason and whatever the causes are, church hurt, disappointment in people, disappointment with God, some kind of traumatic experience in their life, or just the lack of a real experience with God, people just, they move all the way to what I'm going to call atheism. They just, I believed in God, I believed in the traditional teachings, the Orthodox teachings, and now I do not believe any of that. Those have been rare for me, those complete ones. And when I say rare, I mean, I could probably name a dozen people that I've had conversations with. Surprisingly, and I was talking about this just randomly the other day with some people, that I've seen it less in our church and more in our college. And not saying it hasn't happened in our church, it has, but I've seen a lot of I've seen several of our students who went through our college and would even say, well, there's a kid that God's going to use in a great way. They have all the evidence of, knowing Jesus, following Jesus, wanting to be used of Jesus, to gave up on the whole thing. So I've seen that side of it. The other side, the second definition is, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit in another podcast as well, but people have to rethink what they believe about Christianity. And I think deconstruction is a cool term. and I think we make it something because we talk in terms of that. I think there's a deconstruction that happens when people have to get rid of the add-ons to Christianity that were either tribal or cultural, or
could even be theological.
Yeah. That they, and all of a sudden they realize, well, hey, I thought I had to believe that in order to believe this. I actually believe this, or I think I believe this. I don't think I believe that. And for some people, they literally have to give it all up in order to get back to, I just believe this. Okay. And I think that happens on a fairly frequent basis. I think that's happened in my own life. And I mean, and I would never, ever use the word deconstruction. Right. But in other words, and by the way, I think the proper term for that is that you have to be continually reforming yourself to the reality and the essence of the gospel. Not everything that we have been taught to believe is true. It's not essential to the gospel. And we've talked about that in another kind of podcast.
I think we could all give probably quick personal examples of how we've seen both of these flesh out people who've been on a journey. And I agree, maybe less likely that they go from all in to all out, but then certainly, lots of examples of people who've been in a healthy way, even a maturing spiritual faith, and they're reforming, renewing, kind of their understanding. I think a lot of times it's good to kind of frame up how this experience works. I think usually, and I'm sure there's always some exception to this, it's people who've been around the religious block for a while. They grew up in church, they've been around it. They typically have some form of foundational understanding, whether that be culturally within a religious, kind of expression, or just purely in their kind of understanding of faith. I also think a lot of times the work of change toward whatever trajectory, is, and Pastor Tom just said this, is oftentimes kind of instigated by some kind of crisis. And that could be a singular event, or it could be kind of just a general, I'm growing up and I'm thinking differently than I did before. But something a lot of times will motivate people to begin to rethink. Those could be negative circumstances, institute, you've talked to a lot of people. I had a pastor, and then he did this, and it wrecked my faith, and there it goes. It could be I think we're seeing a lot of this, which is different than all of us at the table, the world we were raised in. There's a lot of information out there. Some of it's true and good and helpful. Some of it's not, but it's exposure to an incredibly, kind of broader understanding of all kinds of things, and those can be intellectual crises. And so I think the key difference tends to be about the heart and the motivation is, where am I going? And one of those, and we could probably dissect all the reasons potentially why, one of those is a trajectory away from Christ and the faith. And one of those actually has a proper, healthy, biblical even, the renewing of our minds toward deeper relationship and experience with Jesus, a desire for greater biblical faithfulness. And I really believe that heart posture has a lot of influence on the trajectory of where those kind of quote unquote crises of faith end up taking you.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard for me to let the two terms, because one of them is trajectory based. That first deconstruction is what he talked about, due to church hurt. It's due to poor teaching that they've heard, desires to sin. Like, they want their lifestyle. Yeah. They also want to be called a Christian, so they have to reform Christianity to fit into the lifestyle. And in the world we live now with conspiracy theories, we're deconstructing everything. Yeah. And so there's a trajectory of, we're going to tear this thing apart because it doesn't fit my lifestyle. I've had poor teaching. I've had church hurt. I've got this desire to live this way. And on the other hand is, if you're trying to mature in Christ, there are things that are falling off as you're learning and growing and understanding. Like, I've been listening to Tom teach for 40 years, and we have a big file cabinets in our church office. I found sermons from 1997. And I wouldn't look at that going, well, he's deconstructing his faith. I'm just like, no, he's probably deepened in his understanding. He wasn't trying to teach us untruths. So I think that the argument is, you gave us two definitions, which describe two entirely different processes.
Yeah.
And one is a trajectory of, I'm tearing everything apart. The other one is, I'm deepening and maturing.
The complicated part of it is, they can, not always, and everybody's story is going to be different, but they can actually share like similar origins. Like some people, you know, to use our term here, deconstruct or reform toward healthy faith from a real crisis of integrity.
Sure,
They were taught error. They were part of a terrible Christian subculture that was unhealthy. Those things can be true for two groups of people, and you arrive in two completely different destinations. One's towards health and a deeper relationships with Jesus. One pushes people, you know, out the door. They can actually be very similar in how they start.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Pastor.
Well, yeah, I think here's an anchor point. If you are deconstructing to justify bad behavior,
Okay.
or you're justifying embracing something that is you're saying, like, an example would be, I'm deconstructing because I want to embrace the
X.
LGBTQ plus agenda. Well, God's word doesn't change, and it's foundational. So if we're reforming to something that is unchanging, something that is constant, that's healthy. If we're taking the thing that's constant and unchangeable and we're saying that's wrong, we're rejecting that, that's unhealthy. And we may have to get rid of some things in order to get back to the thing that's unchangeable and that is constant. We shouldn't undo the thing. We shouldn't try to undo and invalidate. And so deconstruction, again, I don't like that term because I think there's a part of it that is more of a cultural thing. But like, I don't mind my kids rethinking things if it helps them to better understand what truth is. And I don't think it's inappropriate to say some things are hard to understand. And doubt is a normal part of experience, right? Tommy referred to, church hurt. Well, if a pastor fails, that doesn't mean that Christianity falls apart.
Right.
It means that we should grieve over the fact that we're led by people who have flaws, who are as capable of being flawed as we are capable of being flawed. That's different than saying, hey, I think culture trumps scripture, and I'm going to jettison what I believe about scripture to embrace what culture says.
Well, referring to what you were saying about, you've seen a lot of this in college age. So if we talk about, I work with teenagers, young adults, what advice would you give to maybe a parent that's listening, that this is resonating with them and they're saying, this is exactly where my 18-year-old or my 21-year-old is in their faith? What would you say to that parent to encourage them or help them? How can they support their young adult that may be rethinking their faith?
Well, let me kind of use my own experience with my kids and kind of where I've settled in emphasis over the last several years in teaching with people. I just had a conversation Sunday after the early service with a new family in our church, and it's clear that God's working in his life, and he was lamenting how he's had this experience over the last month and a half or so, last 3 or 4 weeks particularly, where it's like, man, I've been so dead spiritually for years, and I wonder how far it's making me feel like I got so far from God I can never get back, that kind of conversation. And so I just kind of quickly, you can't do a whole lot of help with people on a 2-minute conversation after a service, but here's the problem. This is what I would say with my kids. This is a conversation I have with my kids. Although I don't more just say this to my kids, I try to help them walk through this experience. Kids grow up believing what they believe because people they respect tell them to believe it. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's normal. We all go through that experience. That's every kid in our church goes through that experience, right? There comes a point where students, young people, have to believe it for a reason other than my dad told me, or my pastor said, or my youth pastor said, or my teacher said, or whatever. A crisis of faith occurs when they don't have enough experiential reality with that truth. And it's depending upon them to believe it, or it has to become real in their life. They can't just get by on, hey, my dad said. That's where the crisis of faith comes. Where we help people, it's that old Jonathan Edwards, right? I can tell you that honey is sweet. And you can know that objectively because you trust what I tell you. At some point, you have to taste the honey for yourself. And when you experience it, it's nice that people tell you that honey is sweet. But once you experience, you don't need people to tell you that it's sweet. You know it. Mm-hmm. And it's getting young people particularly to get from, I believe this because people I respect have told me. And now I've tasted and seen for myself that the Lord is good. I believe this because I've experienced it. Mm. Whatever that secret is the secret to growing healthy followers of Jesus and seeing them stay in the faith.
Agree with everything he said. I think it's really good. He'd said something earlier that it made me think. So you said while we're going through this, the right trajectory, hate the word deconstruction, agree. There's things that you'll find out, this fell off. Like, hey, this is something we may have thought or taught, and it's really probably not core to what we believe. Mm-hmm. Here's where, for me, the tension comes. This is just practical as a parent of a 30-year-old and a few 20-year-olds and 4 grandkids. When the trajectory of deconstruction intersects what we're trying to say, oh, this is not as important anymore, and those two lines intersect, it creates a little bit of a credibility crisis on the part of us who did the teaching. So the fear of a parent should be, if I absolutize something that is not absolute and have to reverse course on that at some point, okay, if you were wrong and you made that absolute, what else? And it really forces them into this. So people that I graduated with, people that, went to school with, people I went to college with, we don't believe anything differently about the core of the gospel. That is the unchanging core of what you said. Let's get back to the real building. But some of the trappings of Christianity that we've kind of said, hey, listen, that's probably not where we should have landed in year number. When we've said, hey, listen, that's we've moved because we think we have a better understanding of Scripture. We think we have a better understanding of the intention of, when those two lines intersect, it does create a little bit of a credibility crisis. And as a parent, if you do that, you're asking, what do you say to your young people? Yeah. Some of the most valuable lessons I had with my kids is when they'd ask me a question, I go, I don't know, but it's not the chief concern. Here's what we know to be true, and we're going to work together as we work through this.
I think what Tommy's saying actually gets to a key point. And again, not in every circumstance, somebody could be really wrestling with a core Orthodox understanding. Is Jesus the Son of God? You could wrestle with that, and there's doubt, and work through that. I do think what Tommy's getting at actually gets to, among younger people, if you could give them some space to articulate, and actually engage in a healthy conversation, not be shocked by the fact that they're wrestling. And a lot of times what you'll find, what is at the rub is actually oftentimes not some kind of challenge with what I would call orthodox truth. It's a challenge with some expression of it, some experience of the broader kind of church culture they've had, maybe what, again, depending on the age and the person, what they grew up being taught, that was, and so all of a sudden you realize, oh, they're not actually trying to break away from Orthodox Christianity. What's really got them in this real place of challenge is some other circumstance. Yeah, a person they trusted disappointed them, or a pastor had a moral failing, or whatever, fill in the blank. Then you can begin to actually, in a helpful and healthy way, work through and help them separate. Well, what you're struggling with actually isn't part and parcel of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and it might be okay for you to let that go, as long as we're not abandoning, kind of the tenets of the gospel. And I think what you discover in a lot of people, the challenge or the crux of the issue, oftentimes is not Orthodox Christianity. It's a lot of times experiential component of it.
One writer on this, I thought it was wise. He said, you have got to allow the next generation, those following us, to drain the water out of the bathtub without affecting the baby. because there's some dirty water in all of Christianity.
This is not original in me, but it's a simple way to do it. The more rigid you are about the gospel, the more flexible you'll be about everything else. The more flexible you are on the gospel, the more rigid you'll be about everything else. Our problem is we don't have a good grip on the gospel. The better the grip on the gospel, the less important secondary things become to us.
True. Very true.
And the more the less of a grip, or the vice versa, that is true. And you have to, there's a ministerial ego and a ministerial pride that pastors want to be experts about everything. They want to be dogmatic about everything. They want to, be forceful about everything, and that gets you into a lot of trouble because, one, you're not an expert about everything, and not everything is of equal importance. And if you fall in love with power and position, you abuse it. You use it in an unhealthy way in people's lives, and people have to sometimes leave the faith to get away from either the bad teaching or the bad influence of unhealthy leadership. And really, they're probably reacting in a very normal way to something that's unhealthy in their life. And I think pastors have to own that that the whole thing about James, you better be careful about James 3:1 about being desirous to be a master of people. You're going to be held accountable for what you teach and how you teach to people. And I think you have to get that factor in there to help. There needs to be an authenticity and a simplicity about the gospel. Remember, there's a time in Jesus' ministry, many went back and followed him no more, John 6, right? The crowds really fought out. And Jesus taught about deconstruction. He said, 4 kinds of people are going to hear me teach, and they're going to receive the word, right? And 3 of the 4 kinds of hearers are going to leave. Something's going to drive them away. And there's some instructional value in us being able to understand that on both how effective we are teaching, but what happens in the heart of the person that hears.
So if we get a little personal here as we wrap up this conversation, would you all be willing to share maybe some personal beliefs or experiences that you have had to rethink in your own life or your own family? If we're talking about rethinking our faith and breaking it down and maybe letting some stuff go or having a better understanding of the gospel, do you have some real life examples of some things that have happened in your own life where God has taken your rethinking of your faith and moved you maybe in a better understanding of the gospel?
I think we should go in reverse age order.
I'll go quickly. I could probably name a number of things. I think we should all be able to, and that what he just said is so important. I don't think we should gloss over that. The more we're honest with our kids and in church and in our homes, the better off we're going to be. But I think we should all be honest. We've had things we have worked through and reformed our thinking about. One would be for me, very simply, I would say it's the picture of the Big C church. I don't mean this in any disparaging way, because a lot of it was good and helpful to me. I grew up in a tribe that was had a real narrow view of what the church was, and you were either in this slice and everybody outside of that slice was wrong, in a very serious way, wrong. And by God's grace and in the word and experience and maturity and all those kinds of things, it's like you come to realize that the work that God's doing was way bigger than the slice of the pie that I was raised in. And again, most of that was very good and helpful for me. But that was something I had to really rework my thinking on, that God is active and alive across denominations and across geographical boundaries and all kinds of other boundaries that maybe I had been brought up with really high walls, big kind of transformation in my life over a course of years.
Yeah, it's great. You said reverse age order.
You want to go next? I look older. I look older than you. I mean, you can, you know, I could go forever on this. I'm trying to limit it, and I don't know how personal to get, not to get personal. Right. So raised at a tribal type of ministry, right? But had in a family that was not. It was very much more permissive, much more allowing you to learn who you were and not hand it. It was such a great experience. So when I guess the intersection between a family that was allowing your heart to dictate how your faith worked out of you, and then working into a ministry that was maybe the reverse. So I would come in, and that back then, Tom, you'll remember this, you may be the only one that had this thing called the Guard of Honor, right? That's what they called these kids, on the Guard of Honor. These are the ones you would put up on the wall, and this is what you want faith follow. And so
they're like Pharisees.
Yeah, listen, I'm not making a comment, but
Tommy, I was on the Guard of Honor.
Okay, there you go.
Sorry, Joel.
There you
I take back my comment.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I know the guy that did it. I love the idea of that. But here's the problem: is I hung out with the Guard of Honor on Fridays and Saturdays, and then on Sunday they became, and not that they were
right.
But here's the Tommy, you'll never be it because you don't, and fill in the blank, and because you listen to fill in the blank, and because you would rather. And it got such this kind of, so when my kids got older, so Christopher especially and Andrew, I remember the first time they kind of just, their hair went down and came down to here. I had people in the church. I mean, this was in 1990 something, 2000. Like, man, isn't that a shame for a man to have long hair? I'm like, I'm not sure that's what that's talking about. And it was this moment of I'm not going to allow things that are not absolute to be preached to my kids in an absolute way and put them under that pressure in ministry. And so I was not deconstructing my faith. I was reforming my faith to have a healthy balance so that I could present a Christianity and a lifestyle to my kids that they could go, this is a lifelong thing. This is the healthy way to approach Christianity. I could give you 42 examples, none of which were painful for me, but here's what it did. It created cynicism in me toward, okay, if they're that way about that, what else are they like that about that?
Yeah.
And if they, like, I love what Tom said about the pastoral position. If it's created in a position of pride and domination, Mark Lowry said, our pastors are not always right, but they're never in doubt. Well, that's a problem to be that way. So I think I've got a million life histories, and I think we have reached such a healthy place, but there's still some casualties of that all around us. And all you have to do is glance at my Facebook page to see it. Still the casualties of that differential type of Christianity, an inside out versus an outside in.
Pastor experiences for you?
Yeah, well, so I'll give you one to talk about long hair. I had an older member, after I'd been pastoring a few years, grabbed the back of my hair and said, if you'd get your hair cut, the offerings would probably go up. And he was right. I did cut my hair, my offerings would go up. I had two things. It's here was the, I understood it theoretically. I didn't have the vocabulary to articulate what moralism was. And I was in our church historically was Southern Baptist, left Southern Baptist over for theological reasons, identified with the independent Baptist movement, which is a very complicated kind of whole thing anyways. And I think unwittingly, and when I say unwittingly, I don't think there was an intentionality. I think if you sat people down and you had a conversation about the gospel, they could clearly articulate the gospel. What happened was they got confused, and there became confusion and misunderstanding, lack of clarity, theological clarity, between justification and sanctification. And when that happens, then what you do is you begin to think, well, your standing before God is determined by by your sanctification, how you live, what you do, kind of thing. And so there was an enormous amount of pressure when I became pastor. There was a section in our church a section of people in our church that was like, hey, we cannot compromise anything, even to the jot and tittle and the painting of the sepulchres and all the other Pharisaical things. And then there was another side that was really yearning for freedom. The problem was they didn't have enough really kind of depth of They just knew something was not right, but they didn't know how to get. They would have gotten to an unhealthy way. And so we had to really kind of walk that. That has been probably the most difficult part of the journey for me, is trying to navigate through that in a healthy way. I was having a conversation. I'll give you an illustration. I was having a conversation with my daughter yesterday, and it was on speakerphone, and Lisa was talking to Christy, and it was on my phone. I was kind of standing there, and Lisa said, we weren't really good parents, and she and you had to hear the whole conversation, and Lisa was referring to the fact that there was a point in time it was a struggle for us of what we were going to allow Christy to wear and not wear, and I was just kind of listening to them talk. The three of us were in the conversation, but they were most talking, and Lisa goes, we just didn't know some of those things. Those are complicated kind of things to go through. And she wasn't being remorseful. She was just, that's how she remembered it and felt. Christy goes, Mom, that was nothing. You really, there's nothing I regret about my childhood. Now, two things are true. It was a complex issue. We had to figure out how to work through that. And when I say it was complex, we had to kind of walk through it with her. But it was also a defining issue, because it forced me to have to think through, what did those decisions look like? How does that impact her and her view of church, her view of the gospel, her view of what God is like? And fortunately enough, thankfully, I was far along enough in my spiritual maturity to realize that she was way more important than making people happy. And probably for the good of our church, my kids were the right ages, that I didn't have to do a lot of confrontational teaching about it, just by example. And people would come to me regularly and say, oh, you let your kids do that? Or you let your kids do that? Yeah. Can you tell me why? And I don't know. I'm sure I alluded to it or taught some around it or illustrated around it. But a lot of it was just people watched me raise my kids. And they would ask me questions, and I would answer them honestly. Yeah. And, it was a big deal. When Drew was in high school, he did not wear socks. He wore sandals to church on Sunday nights, and his hair was really long. And it's funny, the people loved him, and I think probably at that time they loved me enough that it didn't bother them. And the reason it didn't bother them is they were able to get past holding on to these things because this is where we get our righteousness from, till they had moved to, hey, we love people and the gospel really matters. And, and again, I know we got to quit, but I'd say this. I always found it interesting that we were so easy as a church. It was so easy for us to be accepting of kids that came out of the bus ministry or people that came through our rescue mission. And we were so welcoming and not judgmental. But you get somebody that grew up in the church and, was a student at Trinity Christian Academy and Trinity Baptist College, boy, we drew the line and brought the hammer. But I don't think it's because they had bad heart. I think it's just bad theology. Yeah. And we had to kind of sort out the moralism from all that.
Yeah. Well, I think it was a great discussion today. I really learned a lot. Appreciate you all leaning into this topic. If this is your first time catching the podcast, we encourage you to jump in. We release episodes every single week. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or right on the Trinity app. Right here at Trinity, we want to help everyday people discover an extraordinary life with God. We'll catch you next time.